At every wedding in this family, something goes wrong. Not the cake, not the dress. Gangsters. Guns. Blood on white lace. But right before someone dies, time twists. Bullets miss. Men vanish. Because hidden in the crowd. In every generation. Their guardian is the same. An ancient king. A vampire. The vampire king arrived at the church long before the first guests. He stood in the deep shadow cast by the bell tower, unseen, his gaze fixed on the doors through which his human sister would walk, dressed in white and mortal hopes. The stone beneath his boots remembered older times when he had been a crowned warlord, when his name had carried terror across continents. Now, all that remained of that crown was the invisible weight of an oath he had taken alone, to watch over the fragile line of blood that still linked him to the world of the living. Inside, the hall slowly filled with soft music and the shuffle of shoes. Laughter rolled through the open doors, warm and careless. He listened to the arrangements, to the rustle of silk and the scrape of chairs, to the priest's murmuring as he checked his pages. His sister's scent, faint but unmistakable, drifted to him on the morning air, mixed with lilies and candle wax. She believed he had died centuries ago. It was safer that way. She had grown old enough to marry, to have a life that fit inside one human lifetime, and he had no right to disturb that. When the last guests had taken their places, he entered. The vampire king wore the borrowed face of a distant cousin, a man cobbled together from vague family legends and careful forgeries. His hair was neatly combed, his suit perfectly pressed, his eyes a measured shade of brown instead of the burning color that belonged to his true self. He smiled when people glanced at him, inclined his head, answered no questions. He took a place near the back, where the light from the stained glass windows faltered and shadows gathered like old friends. The ceremony began. The doors opened, and his sister walked in. She held her bouquet as if it were the most delicate thing in the world. Her eyes shone with a happiness he had seen only once before, long ago, when she had been a child chasing fireflies and calling his name across the fields. He let the memory pass like a tide. This moment belonged to her, not to him. For a while, the world narrowed to ritual. Rings were presented, vows spoken, hands joined. The king listened to the words about love, faith, and protection, knowing that none of the mortals present could truly protect each other from what lurked in the dark corners of the world. That burden sat on his shoulders alone. He had accepted it the night he chose to live forever and watch his family die one by one, always replaced by new faces carrying pieces of his old life. The first gunshot tore through the serenity like a jagged crack in glass. It echoed against stone and silenced the music in an instant. The priest froze. Guests turned toward the doors, eyes wide, mouths half open. Another shot followed, then a third. The doors slammed inward, slamming against the walls. Men poured into the church, hard-eyed and armed, their tattoos spelling out loyalties to a criminal empire that ruled the streets beyond this quiet neighborhood. The gangster at their head scanned the pews with casual cruelty. The king recognized the hunger in his gaze, the greed of a man who had discovered the bride's family's hidden wealth and come to claim it by force. The gangster barked orders, and his men surged down the aisle. One tore the bouquet from the bride's hands and threw it aside. Another knocked the groom to his knees. Children cried. Elderly relatives clutched each other, trembling. Fear thickened the air until it brushed against the vampire king's skin like static. He remained seated for a moment longer, letting the scene register in every detail. If he moved too soon, he would reveal himself. If he waited too long, someone would die. He watched the bride's face drain of color, the priest's hand shake, the gangster raise his gun toward a trembling guest who refused to hand over jewelry fast enough. Something in the king's chest, ancient and buried, shifted. He rose to his feet. The disguise he wore was a fragile shell, held in place by will and subtle glamour. As he walked down the aisle, it cracked. His hair darkened, his eyes deepened into a color that reflected blood and long nights. The air seemed to bend around him. Shadows clung to his shoulders like a cloak. The men closest to him hesitated, sensing something wrong, but not yet understanding. He moved faster. In a heartbeat, he stepped between the gun and the terrified guest. Metal barked. The bullet met him in the chest and flattened against skin that was no longer human. It fell to the stone floor with a soft, useless clink. The gangster stared, confusion overtaken by dawning fear. The king's hand lifted, casual and precise, and the gun flew from the man's grasp, sailing down the aisle as if pulled by invisible strings. Panic erupted. Some guests screamed. Others dropped to the ground, covering their heads. Gangsters fired blindly. The church filled with muzzle flashes and the smell of burning powder. The vampire king became a blur of motion, more storm than man. He bent the path of bullets away from hearts, letting them shatter harmlessly against pillars and pews. He struck with open hands and clenched fists, moving with a lethal grace honed over centuries of war. Bones broke. Weapons clattered away. Men who had walked in as hunters now sprawled on the floor as prey. The stained glass windows flickered with color as the battle raged beneath them. Light spilled over the king's figure, catching on the faint red sheen that lined his eyes, on the elongated shape of his canines when he bared his teeth. He shielded the bride with his body, then the groom, then the priest, never allowing a single shot to cross the invisible boundary he set around them. The gangster leader tried to flee, but the king was faster. One moment he was at the altar. The next, he stood before the doors, blocking the way. There was no mercy in the vampire king's gaze. These men had come to tear apart a day of joy, to shatter the fragile peace his sister had finally built for herself. He had tolerated the human world's crimes from a distance, believing that his involvement would only make things worse. But this was different. This was his blood, his family, their laughter, and hopes under threat. When it was over, the church stood in disarray, but the living were unbroken. Gangsters lay unconscious or groaning, disarmed and defeated. A few had fled into the streets, but they would carry a memory that would haunt them for the rest of their shortened lives, a figure in shadows, moving like night itself, eyes like embers. The guests stared at him, some with awe, others with horror. His sister's gaze found his, and in that long, quiet moment, recognition rippled across her features, impossibly spanning the centuries between the brother she had once known and the immortal stranger standing before her. He saw questions forming, a desperate need to understand, to reconcile what she saw with what she remembered. He inclined his head, a small bow of respect and apology. Without a word, he turned away and stepped back into the shadows. The disguise settled over him again, softer now, incomplete but sufficient. By the time the sirens began to wail in the distance and the first police cars turned into the churchyard, the vampire king was gone, leaving behind only scattered bullets, trembling survivors, and a day that would be remembered as a miracle no one could fully explain. Years passed, leaving only faint scars on the city but none on the man who walked through it by night. The vampire king watched his family line grow. Children were born, grew up, and scattered into new homes and lives. Some became teachers, some doctors, some mechanics, some dreamers. A few brushed dangerously close to the darker corners of the world. He nudged them away when he could, adjusting paths from the shadows with small, invisible interventions. His favorite haunt became a hill overlooking a grand hotel where one of his descendants, his niece several generations removed, planned her wedding. The building was made of glass and steel, a far cry from the old stone church of his sister's time, but the pattern felt familiar: flowers, nervous relatives, promise of a new beginning. He watched the preparations unfold from rooftops and alleyways, invisible to everyone except the stray cat that sometimes stared at him from a dumpster. The niece was bright and stubborn, with an energy that reminded him of his sister chasing fireflies. She had worked hard to build a life that did not depend on old wealth or old names. The man she had chosen was kind, earnest, and as mortal as the rest of them. The vampire king approved in his own detached way. He told himself he would not intervene this time. The memory of the church battle still sat heavy in his mind. His appearance had shaken too many people, raised too many questions. He had always tried to keep the living world and his world separate, and each crossing made that separation harder to maintain. Yet unease crept into him as the wedding day approached. The city had changed since that first time. Small-time criminals had grown into organized syndicates. One gang in particular had carved its territory with ruthless efficiency, leaving a trail of blood and fear. Their leader was ambitious and reckless, a man who liked to make public examples of those who crossed him. Rumors reached the king through back alleys and whispered exchanges. A name from his family appeared in those rumors more than once, tied to a business deal that had inadvertently offended the wrong people. On the morning of the wedding, the sky was clear, and the hotel gleamed like a polished gem. Inside, flowers filled the ballroom with scent, and strings of lights waited for the night to fall so they could transform the space into a soft galaxy. The niece stepped into her dress. Relatives took selfies. Music played through speakers instead of a choir's voices. The vampire king watched from the roof of a neighboring building, eyes fixed on the revolving doors below. Hovering between restraint and instinct, he lingered in indecision. He could feel the energy of the event, all those hearts beating in rough unison below, all those vulnerable lives gathered in one place. It was a beacon visible to anyone hunting for leverage or revenge. He stretched his senses outward, listening beyond the laughter, beyond the chatter, trying to catch the sour note of danger. It reached him as a faint, hurried rhythm, footsteps, too heavy and coordinated to belong to guests. Vehicles parked in a side alley, engines still ticking as they cooled. Metallic clinks as weapons were checked. Voices, sharp and low, naming the floor number, the room locations, the family surname. The pattern was clear long before the first intruder stepped across the lobby's bright marble floor. Inside the ballroom, the ceremony was already in motion. The niece stood under an arch of flowers, fingers entwined with her soon-to-be husband's. The officiant's voice flowed over them, weaving promises into the air. Glasses clinked softly at the bar. A band waited at the side, instruments poised for celebration. None of them noticed the elevator doors closing on men whose eyes held no interest in love or vows. The vampire king moved. This time, he did not walk through doors or step politely into view. He stepped out of the world as mortals understood it. With a thought, he seized the threads of time around the hotel and pulled. The world shuddered, then slowed. Sound stretched into a deep, echoing murmur. The hands of clocks in the lobby and ballroom hesitated on their paths, then halted. Inside the hall, flower petals hung motionless in the air where a bouquet had slipped from a nervous bridesmaid's grasp. The king stepped through the freeze as easily as stepping into a quiet room. In this suspended moment, he was alone among statues. Guests were caught mid-breath, mid-laugh, mid-tear. The bride's expression held a mix of joy and nerves. The groom's eyes were fixed on hers. Their hands were joined, fingers curled around promises that time, the normal, relentless time of mortals, had not yet tested. Far above, in the shaft of the elevator, numbers glowed steady, no longer changing. The doors on the ballroom floor had just begun to part when the world stopped. Behind them, the gangsters stood shoulder to shoulder, faces set in hard lines, weapons ready. The vampire king walked toward them, his footsteps soundless on the frozen air. In the strange stillness, every detail was sharp. The scuff on a shoe, the nick on a gun's metal edge, the fading tattoo of a forgotten lover's name on a wrist. He read their intentions as clearly as a written plan, stormed the ballroom, seized the bride and selected relatives, used them as bargaining chips to force a payout. If anyone resisted, make an example. Such plans assumed time would move in a straight, obedient line. The king smiled without warmth and stepped into the elevator car. The men did not see him. Their eyes stared past him, locked on the space where the doors would finish opening. He reached for their weapons, prying fingers loose without resistance, sliding guns from hands that did not yet know they had lost them. He bent barrels, emptied magazines, scattered bullets on the floor like seeds that would never sprout. Knives vanished from belts, disappearing into shadow. When he had disarmed them, he did not simply leave them standing. Old instincts urged him toward bloodshed, toward punishment and permanent solutions. For a moment, his thoughts dipped back into centuries of war. But this was his niece's wedding, not a battlefield, and the line between protection and butchery was one he still tried to respect. Instead, he nudged their bodies subtly, shifting their balance just enough that when time resumed, they would stumble rather than charge. He repeated this process throughout the building. On a stairwell, he found another group of men, one carrying a duffel bag of restraints. In a service corridor, a lookout stood by a staff entrance, glancing at his phone, the screen frozen mid-notification. One by one, the king removed their weapons and sabotaged their plans. He broke radio earpieces, snapped phone batteries, rearranged them like pieces on a game board whose rules only he understood. When he returned to the ballroom, the sight of his family frozen in celebration struck him with unexpected force. Here were lives that moved forward, even if he did not. Here were faces that would age, laugh, argue, reconcile, grow tired, and eventually fade. The Vampire King stood among them like a fixed point, immune to the erosion of years. He wondered, not for the first time, whether his continued presence in their orbit was a kindness or a cruelty. He reached out and brushed a petal hanging in the air near the bride's shoulder. It did not move. Time here belonged to him for as long as he wished, but such power came with a cost. Every time he seized it, he felt the weight of existence pull tighter, like a thread wound one loop closer to breaking. Satisfied that no immediate harm could reach the wedding, he released his grip. Sound crashed back in. The band's instruments hummed faintly. The officiant's voice resumed the sentence exactly where it had paused. The bouquet finished its fall, landing softly against the floor. In the elevator, the doors slid fully open, revealing a cluster of men suddenly off balance, weapons missing, comical surprise replacing their planned aggression. They stumbled, collided, and fell in an undignified tangle. Confusion erupted. Hotel security, alerted by the sudden commotion, rushed in from the hallways. Without guns or coordination, the intruders were quickly overwhelmed. Some tried to claim they had been attacked by something unseen. Others insisted their weapons had simply vanished. Their accounts sounded like the babbling of men who had taken the wrong drugs at the wrong time. Inside the ballroom, the wedding continued after a brief interruption. Guests whispered, speculating about attempted robbery or some criminal misunderstanding that had been conveniently thwarted. The niece and her husband clung to each other, shaken but intact. The officiant, flustered but determined, carried the ceremony to its conclusion. Applause rose, hesitant at first, then swelling as if to drown out the unsettling edges of the incident. From his vantage point on the hotel roof later that night, the Vampire King watched the reception through the glass. People danced under warm lights, their movements fluid and unburdened by knowledge of how close they had come to terror. He imagined what their memories would feel like over time, a story about almost being attacked at a wedding, a story that grew hazier with each retelling, eventually turning into a half-believed anecdote. He let the music drift up to him, allowed himself the smallest measure of satisfaction. He had broken his vow not to interfere again, but he could not bring himself to regret it. The line of blood that bound him to these mortals was thin, but it was still a line. He would follow it wherever it led, through decades and changing skylines, through rituals repeated in new forms. The night deepened, and the lights of the city blinked like distant stars. Somewhere below, his niece laughed, the sound lost in the hum of traffic and distant sirens. The Vampire King turned away and walked into the shadows, knowing that the world would continue spinning, fragile and oblivious, and that he would be there each time his family's joy attracted the wrong kind of attention. The balance between his world and theirs grew more complicated with each generation. Old lines blurred, new alliances formed where he least expected them. Rumors of creatures like him had faded into fiction for most humans, but the underworld, the real underworld of criminals and clandestine powers, retained a certain openness to myths that could be weaponized. It began as a whisper among gangs and syndicates, a rumor of an immortal figure who intervened in select human affairs, always tied to the same family name. Some saw opportunity, others threat. Among them was a crime lord whose ambition extended beyond the city streets to something larger, more symbolic. He had built his empire through calculated brutality and unexpected charm, straddling the line between legitimate businessman and shadow ruler. this man had a daughter. She grew up in a world of velvet and steel, learning to read both business contracts and the subtle language of fear in a person's eyes. She was intelligent, weary of the violence that trailed her father, and quietly determined to step into a different kind of power. She met the Vampire King's nephew, a pale, reflective young man who had inherited the immortal blood more directly than most of their kin, through a series of business negotiations. Their relationship began as wariness, sharpened by the knowledge of what each of their families represented. The king observed from a distance as the two drifted closer, drawn by shared exhaustion with the worlds they inhabited. The nephew had centuries behind him but carried them lightly, clinging to a stubborn belief that peace with humans could be more than a temporary truce. The daughter carried the burden of a criminal legacy she had not chosen, hoping to reshape it from within. The king had seen many romances bloom and wither across time, but this one threaded itself directly through the heart of the city's underworld. When talks of marriage surfaced, astonishment rippled through both sides. For the vampires allied with the king, it was an unprecedented step, binding their bloodline to that of a human crime lord. For the human underworld, it was a proposition that sounded halfway to folklore. The crime lord, once he overcame his shock at the revelations about his prospective in-laws, saw in the union a chance to anchor his power in something older and more fearsome than any rival gang. The Vampire King listened to the proposal in the quiet of an abandoned cathedral, where he met with his nephew under cover of deep night. Memories stirred. He had seen peace treaties brokered before, marriages used to bridge feuding houses and warring kingdoms. Most had crumbled eventually under the pressure of old grudges and newly invented betrayals. Yet he could not deny the potential here. If the crime lord's empire could be redirected, tempered, restrained by something beyond purely human ambition, perhaps fewer mortals would bleed in alleyways and unmarked graves. Reluctantly, he agreed. The wedding was set in a lavish estate on the edge of the city, where manicured gardens met high walls and private security. Human guards mixed uneasily with vampire sentinels, their respective stances revealing different understandings of threat. Strings of lights draped from trees, casting a soft glow over tables laden with food and drink that only half the guests could truly enjoy. The Vampire King took a seat in the shadows, content to watch rather than participate in the complicated dance of politics unfolding around him. Not everyone welcomed the union. Among the human gangs, one rival crime boss saw the marriage as an existential threat. With vampires as allies, his competitor would become untouchable. The rival whispered to like-minded men in back rooms thick with smoke and resentment, appealing to their pride and their fear. He crafted a plan not just to disrupt the wedding but to end both families in one decisive strike. On the day of the ceremony, the air was heavy with scents, expensive cologne, cut grass, the faint metallic tang of concealed weapons. Guests arrived in sleek cars and silent carriages, depending on their nature and preferred theatrics. The bride and groom wore expressions steeped in more than personal emotion. They were symbols as much as lovers, carrying the weight of two worlds on their shoulders. The first hint of trouble came not from a visible attack but from the absence of certain expected eyes. The king, accustomed to reading patterns, noticed the gap in the crowd, a space where he knew informants and spies from the rival side should have lurked, quietly gathering information. Their absence was too clean, too deliberate. He followed the thread of unease with his senses, stretching them beyond the estate's walls, probing the darkness beyond the gardens. He found them assembling near the edge of the property, a private army armed with more than pistols and knives. They had brought heavier weapons, the kind meant to break through stone and flesh alike. The rivals' plan was simple and devastating: strike during the height of the ceremony, trap both vampire and human leaders in a crossfire, and emerge as the sole unchallenged power in the aftermath. The Vampire King slipped from his seat like a shadow detaching from a figure. He moved across the garden unseen, past guests engrossed in conversation. He passed the bride's father as the man stood near the bar, smiling tightly and gauging the room with the instinct of a predator in an unfamiliar den. The king knew he could not fight this battle alone. The scale of the attack demanded a coordinated defense, a swift alliance that would be tested in its first moment of existence. He stepped into a nook where the darkness was thickest and let the aura of his power expand. In the minds of the vampires present, ancient signals resonated, a call to arms, a warning that the meeting meant to bind them to humanity was itself under attack. Those attuned to him stiffened, eyes sharpening, nostrils flaring. They turned their attention outward, to the unseen perimeter beyond the lights. On the crime lord's side, instincts born from decades of surviving ambushes and coups sparked. Whispered reports filtered in from outer patrols. Unmarked vehicles where there should have been none. Movement in the trees. The crime lord's gaze met the vampire king's across the garden, and in that moment, a truce deeper than any contract passed between them. Their survival depended on mutual trust. The attack came like a thunderclap. Explosions shattered portions of the outer wall, sending fragments of stone into the air. Men in dark gear surged through the breaches, firing indiscriminately. Guests screamed, overturned tables, dove for cover. The bride's dress streaked with dirt as she was pulled to the ground by instinctive protectors. The groom dragged a wounded guard out of the line of fire, his jaw tight with fury. The vampire king moved forward, not as a hidden guardian this time, but as a commander stepping onto a field that demanded his full presence. He joined his vampires at the front line, their eyes gleaming, their fangs bared. Beside them, the crime lord's personal guard formed a solid wall of human muscle and metal. For the first time, bullets and supernatural strength were aimed in the same direction. The rival gang had counted on chaos. Instead, they found unexpected coordination. Vampires moved faster than the intruders could track, turning streams of bullets aside with unnatural agility, ripping weapons from hands and rendering them useless. Human guards used their familiarity with firearms to provide covering fire, targeting exposed attackers with ruthless precision. Where a vampire's strike left an enemy disoriented, a human shot finished the job. The estate gardens, moments before a picture of cultivated beauty, morphed into a battlefield of shattered stone and torn earth. Decorative fountains cracked under the impact of stray rounds. Carefully trimmed hedges burned as grenades misfired. Yet through it all, a fragile core remained untouched, the space where the bride and groom sheltered under the temporary shield of bodies and hastily erected barriers. The vampire king took the brunt of the rival leader's fury. The man had accompanied his forces personally, confident that his presence would ensure victory. He confronted the king near a broken marble statue, eyes filled with a hatred that came from both fear and wounded pride. The rival had built his life on being the most dangerous man in any room. Facing something older and of a different order entirely shook the foundation of that belief. The king accepted the confrontation with a cold calm. His movements were economical and brutal, stepping through attacks with centuries of honed technique. He allowed the human to see, in those moments, what it meant to challenge a creature that had once commanded armies and feasted on the exhaustion of battlefield medics. When the rival finally fell, wounded beyond recovery and gasping on the ruined lawn, the king did not bother to offer words of judgment. The man's own choices had already spoken enough. As the last of the attackers were subdued or fled into the night, a strange quiet settled over the estate. The lights continued to glow above, some shattered, some flickering. The music had long since stopped. The guests emerged slowly from hiding, their faces a mixture of shock and grim determination. For both human and vampire, the battle had stripped away illusions about the ease of this proposed union. The bride and groom stood together, clothes torn, eyes resolute. Around them, their families regarded each other with new understanding. They had survived not just an attack, but a trial of trust. The crime lord met the vampire king in the center of the ruined garden. There were no formal declarations, no ceremonial gestures. Their shared glance and slight nod were enough. The truce they had once considered optional had been forged into something stronger by fire. Time, for mortals, moved briskly forward in the years that followed. For the vampire king, it trickled in familiar patterns, looping and echoing as new faces appeared wearing old expressions. The uneasy alliance between his kind and the human underworld held, not perfectly, but firmly enough to prevent large-scale conflicts. Violence did not vanish, but its random cruelty lessened. Both sides had seen what happened when chaos broke free at a wedding, and neither wanted a repeat. The king, however, could not remain comfortably embedded in these new structures. His nature resisted stagnation, and the more visible he became, the greater the risk of discovery and panic. Humanity had entered an age of surveillance and instant communication. One clear recording of his true abilities, leaked and replayed across millions of screens, could unravel the careful separation he had maintained for centuries. So he retreated again, returning to the edges of things. He watched his family's lives from vantage points where cameras did not reach. Rooftops, forgotten fire escapes, maintenance tunnels, quiet corners of old libraries. His presence became less a rumor and more a superstition, a sense that someone was watching over them, that disasters seemed to sidestep him more often than chance would allow. One branch of his family, descended from the sister whose wedding he had once defended in a church now turned into a historical landmark, settled in a quiet countryside town. They chose a small, ivy-draped inn as their home and livelihood, an old building with creaking floors and sunlit windows. Life there moved at a different tempo than in the city, measured in seasons and returning guests rather than in nightly news reports. The king visited often in the guise of a traveler passing through. He rented the same corner room each time, praised the quality of the coffee, and left generous tips. The children of the house grew up knowing him as a polite, slightly odd man who always seemed the same age. They never questioned it. Some people simply did not change much, they told themselves, and then thought no further. One of those children, a son, eventually left for the city. He found work, love, and trouble in uneven measures. Old family debts, forgotten by most, caught up with him there. A small sum owed decades ago had grown, through compound interest and the predatory logic of criminal bookkeeping, into something that drew the attention of a notorious gangster. The man traced the young accountant's roots back to the quiet inn and saw, in its steady business and old-world charm, an opportunity for leverage. The decision to target the family was made in a cold office lit by neon and reflected off chrome. The gangster's lieutenants suggested simpler methods, legal pressure, intimidation tactics, but their leader preferred spectacles. A rural wedding, far from the city's heavy police presence, offered the perfect stage. The young man's sister, preparing to marry a local schoolteacher, had unknowingly chosen the date of her family's greatest vulnerability. On the day of the ceremony, the countryside hummed with subdued excitement. Children chased each other between rows of chairs set up in the inn's garden. Wildflowers braided into garlands hung from tree branches. A small band tuned instruments on the porch. The bride's dress, simple and elegant, brushed the old wooden floor as she paced in nervous anticipation. The vampire king arrived before dawn. He walked the perimeter of the inn, tracing invisible lines of protection in his mind. The countryside air tasted cleaner than the city's, but danger carried the same scent everywhere: oil, metal, nervous sweat, the sharp tang of intention. He knew the young man's history, had watched his struggles and silent attempts to right old wrongs. The debt that had led the gangster here was not entirely the young man's fault, yet the consequences would fall on everyone he loved. Guests from the town arrived in clusters, some on foot, others in cars with dusty windshields. They brought homemade desserts and awkward jokes, blessings and poorly wrapped gifts. None of them imagined that the quiet lane leading to the inn would soon bear the weight of vehicles loaded with weapons. The king took a seat on the porch, appearing as another distant cousin, his presence barely remarked upon. When the gang arrived, they did so without ceremony. A convoy of dark vehicles rolled up the lane, their engines too loud for the tranquil setting. The music faltered, then stopped entirely. Conversations died mid-sentence. The bride's father stepped forward, confusion and concern etched on his face. The young man recognized the emblem on the lead car's windshield and felt his stomach drop. The current of fear that swept through the gathered guests triggered something old in the vampire king, something that linked backwards through decades to the church, the hotel, the estate. Weddings, places where joy concentrated, seemed to call out to predators and to him in equal measure. He rose from his chair, feeling the pattern repeat yet again, each loop slightly altered but fundamentally the same. The gangster emerged from the car with a casual self-assurance. He looked around at the decorations, the guests, the aging inn, and smiled a thin smile. To him, this was just another negotiation table with better scenery. He had come armed not only with guns but with legal papers, debt ledgers, and threats dressed as offers. He intended to leave with control of the inn and a family permanently under his thumb. His men spread out, hands hovering near concealed weapons. The townsfolk recognized danger when they saw it. Parents pulled children close. The band stepped back, instruments lowered. The bride clutched her bouquet a little tighter, knuckles white. The vampire king stepped down from the porch. This time, there was no pretense of ignorance in his movements. He had tired of long games and half measures, of trying to shield his family by only minor interventions. The world had hardened, and so had the methods of those who preyed upon the innocent. If he wanted to end the cycle of attacks at joyous gatherings, he would need to make a statement that even the most stubborn gangster could understand. As he walked toward the center of the garden, the sunlight dimmed slightly, as if a cloud had passed overhead. The breeze, which moments before had carried the scent of food and flowers, now seemed to hold its breath. The gangster watched him approach with mild curiosity that shifted slowly to unease. There was something wrong in the stranger's posture, something ancient and unflinching. The king's eyes swept over the gathering. The young man stood stiff with shame, knowing this danger had followed him here. The bride trembled but did not back away. The inn's aging walls seemed to lean forward, bearing witness. For a fleeting instant, the king considered letting this play out in human terms, letting negotiations and compromises chip away at the problem. But the memory of the crime lord's alliance, of rival bosses willing to slaughter dozens at a time, reminded him that human terms had limits. He drew on power he had tried not to use in such a direct way in recent years. The shadows cast by trees and walls lengthened, stretching toward him like ink spills reversing their flow. The air cooled. Every heartbeat in the garden, human, animal, and otherwise, fell into a slower, synchronized rhythm. The gangsters' men reached for their weapons, but their movements felt sluggish, as though they were pushing through water. The vampire king advanced with a calm, terrible certainty. He did not need time manipulation here. He carried something heavier, presence. It bore down on the intruders, pressing them toward the realization that they had made a mistake no threat or bravado could counter. What followed did not last long. The men who had come prepared to terrorize a rural wedding found themselves facing something beyond their experience. Guns slipped from nerveless fingers. Knees buckled. Those few who tried to fire saw their bullets veer away as if the air itself refused to cooperate. The king moved among them, directing the flow of fear and pain with surgical precision. He did not slaughter them outright. Instead, he marked them with an understanding they would never shake. By the time he finished, the gangster lay on the gravel drive, staring up at a sky that seemed too wide. His body shook not from injuries alone but from the knowledge that he had glimpsed a predator higher on the chain than he had ever imagined. The king knelt beside him, not speaking, just letting the silence deepen around them until it felt like its own kind of sentence. When the intruders finally retreated, dragging their wounded with them, they took more than bruises and broken bones back to the city. They carried a story. It would spread through the underworld in fragments and exaggerations, but the core would remain. This family was protected by something no gun or threat could easily reach. The guests at the wedding stood in a stunned hush. Many of them would struggle to recall the exact details later. Some would insist the gangsters' men had lost their nerve and simply panicked. Others would remember a stranger whose presence had shifted the entire feel of the day, though they would struggle to articulate how. The bride and groom held each other tightly, deciding without discussing it that this day would not be stolen from them. The ceremony resumed in a muted, yet fierce spirit. Vows were spoken with more weight, as if everyone present understood now how fragile the chance to make them truly was. The inn, patched and repaired and reinforced by countless memories, took this event into its walls as another layer of history. From a distance at the edge of the property, the vampire king watched the reception unfold. Lanterns glowed, music returned, laughter rose again, though edged with something rawer and more grateful. He knew that this might be the last time he could intervene so openly. Each appearance, each display of power, threaded another strand into the tapestry of stories about him. Sooner or later, those stories might draw the wrong kind of attention from beyond criminals and local legends. Still, as he watched his family dance under the trees, he allowed himself a rare feeling, the sense that, for a moment, he had pushed back the darkness enough to let them celebrate without fear. Generations turned like pages in a worn book. Photographs replaced paintings on walls, and then screens replaced photographs in hand. The Vampire King learned to navigate this new landscape of digital shadows, careful never to let his reflection linger anywhere a camera might capture him. He had become an expert at erasure, at slipping through time without leaving more than a faint impression. His family's branches spread across cities and countries, some thriving, others fracturing, then healing in new forms. There were fewer weddings held at old churches or countryside inns now. Many took place in modern civic buildings, streamlined spaces designed for efficiency more than atmosphere. Yet the core remained the same: vows, gathered witnesses, fragile hope. One of his human descendants, a young woman in a busy city, worked in the maze of bureaucracy that kept those civic buildings running. She was practical, intelligent, and given to quiet acts of kindness that slipped by unnoticed in the rush of official schedules. When she met the person she would marry, it was not with fireworks but with the slow, steady warmth of shared days. They chose a city hall wedding for convenience and simplicity. No massive guest lists, no sprawling estates to rent, no complicated negotiations between extended families. Just a room, a handful of loved ones, and the signatures that would align the law with what their hearts already understood. The Vampire King approved of this choice. Smaller gatherings meant fewer open invitations to predators. Even so, a threat emerged. A rival gang seeking revenge on a city official misidentified the young woman's wedding as their target. Their intended victim shared a similar name and had scheduled a ceremony in the same building on the same day. Information, passed through too many hands and filtered through too much carelessness, warped into a fatal misunderstanding. The gang prepared to storm the city hall, planning to make an example that would ripple through the news and send a clear message to their enemies. The Vampire King learned of this by accident, overhearing fragments of conversation as he trailed a different line of danger through the city's underbelly. When he pieced the plan together and realized who would be caught in the crossfire, a chill he had not felt in decades settled into him. The pattern was repeating once more, but now in a building tied to the workings of the city itself, where any overt intervention risked exposure on a scale he had never faced. On the day of the wedding, the city rose into its usual rhythm: honking cars, crowded sidewalks, the constant hum of distant construction. The city hall's facade blended into the urban fabric, its steps climbed by couples, clerks, lawyers, and petitioners. Inside, security guards rotated through their shifts, scanning visitors' bags with practiced boredom. The young woman arrived with her partner and a small circle of family members. Some carried flowers. Others carried the nervous energy that clings to events where emotion runs ahead of logistics. They passed through metal detectors without incident, climbed the stairs, and entered the appointed room where a clerk waited with a stack of neatly arranged forms. The Vampire King had been there long before, standing on the roof, then slipping inside through service corridors. He mapped escape routes in his mind, tested the boundaries of his power in a building dense with human traffic. The city hall was laced with cameras, sensors, and watchful eyes. He could not afford to freeze time for long without drawing attention to anomalies: security footage that skipped seconds, clocks that disagreed with each other, people feeling a strange gap they could not explain. He would have to be precise. The gang approached in staggered waves, blending with the flow of people as they entered the building. Some carried concealed weapons, others the hard, brittle posture of men heading toward violence they had convinced themselves was necessary. Their leader, hardened by a lifetime of clawing upward through the underworld, believed this act would cement his status. He did not care that his information might be flawed. What mattered was the impact. As they crossed the threshold, the Vampire King made his move. He did not stop time fully. Instead, he stretched it just enough to widen the spaces between heartbeats, to slow movements to the edge of perceptibility. In that liminal space, he slipped through security lanes unseen, drifting past guards whose eyes brushed his outline without registering it. He altered paths subtly, adjusting the placement of a bag here, the angle of a security camera there, creating blind spots where he needed them. In the stairwell, he met the first wave of intruders. He stepped between them and their destination, not as a blur or a phantom, but as a figure whose presence demanded attention even in the slow-motion world. Their pupils widened as their instincts screamed that something was wrong. Their hands reached for weapons that seemed suddenly heavier, slower to draw. He removed a gun from a holster with effortless grace, dismantling it in midair and letting the harmless pieces fall in a pattern that would later be explained away as an accident or a malfunction. He nudged another man's foot against the edge of a step, ensuring that when time snapped fully back into place, the man would stumble and take others down with him. On the upper floor, he found the leader checking his watch, irritated by what he perceived as delays. The king let more of his true nature seep into the space between them. Shadows pulled toward him, clinging to his outline. The air grew heavier. For a heartbeat stretched nearly to infinity, the leader glimpsed something beyond comprehension in the stranger's eyes: countless nights, countless deaths, a patience that rendered human ambition small and fragile. That glimpse was enough. When time resumed its normal flow, chaos erupted not in the wedding room but in the corridors leading to it. Intruders collided. Fire alarms, tripped by subtle adjustments, blared. Sprinklers activated in the wrong places at the right time, drenching weapons and scattering plans. Security, alerted by the confusion, converged on the disturbance. The gang's attempt at a coordinated strike dissolved into clumsy scuffles and panicked retreats. The wedding ceremony continued behind a closed door, the clerk's steady voice guiding the couple through vows and signatures. The muffled noise from outside registered as little more than distant building activity. No one inside the room realized how close they had come to catastrophe, or how narrowly their moment had been kept intact. After the ceremony, as the newlyweds stepped out onto the city hall steps, the air felt unusually fresh. They laughed, posed for photographs taken on phones, and tried to ignore the lingering sense that the building staff seemed more rattled than usual. A few officers stood in clusters, speaking into radios. An ambulance pulled away, siren off, suggesting injuries but not fatalities. From across the street, partially obscured by the shadow of a lamppost, the vampireking watched. The city's noise washed around him, oblivious to the quiet triumph he felt. He had intervened with precision, like a surgeon working in a crowded emergency room, leaving no trace beyond the frazzled nerves of men who would later struggle to explain why their plans had collapsed so completely. The young woman glanced in his direction once, eyes skimming over the crowd. For a fleeting instant, her gaze almost caught on him, drawn by some faint recognition in the way he held himself. Then her partner called her name, and she turned away, running down the steps to join in another photograph, another laugh. The vampire king stood alone amid the flow of strangers, an unchanging figure in a world that would continue to change with or without him. He thought of all the weddings he had watched, all the times joy had attracted violence and he had stepped in to redirect the story. He knew he could not protect them from everything. There would be heartbreaks he could not prevent, illnesses he could not cure, quiet betrayals he would never see. But he could do this much. He could stand between his family and the worst of the darkness at key moments, nudging bullets off course, freezing time long enough to disarm a would-be killer, shattering the nerve of a gangster who mistook vulnerability for weakness. He could erase memories when necessary, leaving behind only a sense of having been spared by something unseen. As the newlyweds walked away down the busy sidewalk, hands clasped, the king turned and melted into the city's veins, alleyways, rooftops, service tunnels. No one noticed his absence any more than they had noticed his presence. The stories about him would continue to circulate in whispers and half-believed rumors. Some would call him a guardian spirit. Others would insist he was nothing more than coincidence dressed up in superstition. He knew the truth lay somewhere between those descriptions. He was neither savior nor phantom, but a king without a throne, carrying an old promise across a world that barely remembered crowns. His family's blood threaded onward, fragile and luminous in the vast tapestry of humanity. As long as that thread remained, he would follow it, wedding to wedding, crisis to crisis, a silent protector in the background of their happiest days.